If you've ever wanted to make your own little animation, or perhaps even a simple game, you've probably run into the same problem. The amount of art you have to do is endless. For a single person, it's impossible. But each of the backgrounds you're seeing right now took me around 20 minutes to make, and I think they turned out pretty well. And the best part is that they are actually practical to animate. In this video, I'm going to show you what I think is the perfect art style for beginners who want to get into animation. It's called the UPA style, and it was created over 70 years ago, but it works surprisingly well with modern vector graphics. We'll be using Inkscape, and everything you'll see here is done with nothing more than a keyboard and mouse, no drawing tablet required. Now, if you've never used Inkscape before, I recently uploaded a complete free 1-hour course that teaches all the basics. Once you've gone through that, you'll be ready to follow this tutorial and pretty much every other video on the channel. You'll find the link in the description. Other than that, let's get started. If you're planning to make your own animation, one of the first decisions you have to make is what style. Unless you have a team behind you, you can't afford to spend hours drawing every single background. Even something as simple as the types of backgrounds I've shown on the channel before can end up being too time consuming if you have to make 10, 20 or 100 of them. That's why I think it's worth looking at how professional animation studios solved this problem long before computers even existed. UPA, or United Productions of America, was an animation studio from the 1950s whose influence is still felt up to this day. Instead of trying to compete with the super productions of Disney by making everything more detailed, they went the opposite direction. They embraced flat colors, simple geometric shapes, abstract compositions, and a much more graphic way of drawing. But to me, the interesting part is that those decisions weren't just artistic, they were practical. They needed a style that was faster to draw and faster to animate. And that's exactly why I think it works so well with Inkscape. An already efficient workflow that relies on graphical shapes becomes even more powerful with modern vector design tools. In Inkscape you can change colors anytime you want, resize or reshape objects without redrawing them, and reuse the same assets over and over again. In a way, now we have tools available that those artists back in the 50s could only have dreamed of. That's why I think the UPA style and Inkscape are such a perfect match. So, if I've managed to convince you that the UPA style is worth checking out, let me show you some of the things I've noticed while studying it over the last couple of days. The first thing that really stood out to me was just how much empty space these backgrounds have. They make heavy use of negative space with only a handful of carefully placed objects. It gives everything this timeless, almost surreal feeling. It looks really nice in my opinion. Something else I found really interesting is how the foreground and background often merge together. There is no separation between planes, which I find quite unique. I tried to replicate this in the interior scene I made. The wall and the floor are actually the exact same color. Everything else is simply arranged on top of that large shape. It creates a really bold statement in my opinion. But from an Inkscape perspective, it's also really practical. Instead of juggling lots of separate pieces, you're mostly working with a few large vector shapes that you can move around, reshape or recolor in just a couple of seconds. The city scene I made works the same way. The buildings in the background blend together into one large shape with almost no sense of depth. In fact, the style almost rejects the idea of realistic depth altogether, and I find that quite hilarious for some reason. We're always taught that a good composition needs overlapping objects with perspective and lots of layers, and here it's almost the opposite. Everything is flatter, simpler, and somehow it still works really well. The next thing that I immediately noticed was the lack of perspective. UPA artists seem to be allergic to perspective grids. I think most artists are, so that's good news for us. Instead of building depth, the objects are just floating in space. The ground planes are only suggested when they are absolutely necessary, usually with one or two large shapes doing most of the work. Once you stop trying to make everything perfectly three-dimensional, you realize how much freedom this style gives you. You can move things around, resize them or completely change the composition without worrying that the perspective will suddenly break. That's another reason I think it works so well with Inkscape. It's really easy to quickly test out different compositional ideas by moving, duplicating or resizing objects. Later productions inspired by UPA, like the Hanna-Barberas from the 60s, started adding a little more depth to their backgrounds, especially in outdoor scenes. They introduced more layers and a bit more overlapping to make the forest and landscapes feel richer. That's the direction I took for this nature scene. There is some overlap between the trees and hills, but it's very restrained. The goal is not to get a realistic sense of depth, you just want to add interest. Notice how the shapes are barely overlapping. It's almost like the style adds depth reluctantly, just enough to make the concept of the environment understandable, but not a single layer more. The next thing you'll notice is the use of color. UPA backgrounds rely heavily on large, flat blocks of solid color. And once again, that's great news for us because it means a lot less work. Later studios inspired by UPA started introducing more texture, gradients, and other little details to make the background feel richer. I usually don't like these sort of things, but in the case of these super simple bare-bone backgrounds, a bit of texture and gradients can really help in my opinion. Now, if you used Inkscape before, you already know that adding texture isn't exactly its strongest feature. Fingers crossed things change in the future. And instead of fighting the program, there is one simple thing you can do that can go a long way. Just find and download a noise texture. Any grungy texture will do the job. Then import it into Inkscape, place it over the entire composition and lower its opacity. Then experiment with the blend modes in the fill and stroke dialog. Usually multiply works really well, and reduce the opacity until the texture is almost invisible. It's a subtle detail, but it breaks up those large flat areas of color, just enough to make the whole illustration feel a little more organic. Now let's talk about shapes, the objects themselves, because in my opinion, they are the backbone of the UPA style and the reason why it's so effective. After studying a bunch of these backgrounds, I noticed two things that kept showing up over and over again. The first is the line work. Many objects are drawn using nothing but outlines, with no feel at all. And when they do have color, it's often just a flat shape sitting loosely behind the line art. Almost like an old printing mistake where the feel doesn't line up with the outlines. The second thing is that the drawings are intentionally rough. The lines avoid being perfectly parallel, circles aren't really circles, and even simple geometric objects look like they are a napkin sketch. That roughness is a huge part of what gives this style its personality. And the great thing is that it also makes the style much easier to draw. For most objects, I just use the pen tool with a stroke and no feel. Ironically, I found the hardest part to be resisting the temptation to make the objects clean and symmetrical. It's almost like you have to unlearn to draw well. If you want that classic misprint effect, just place a simple flat shape behind the line art and make it go outside of the silhouette a bit. It doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, it looks better when it isn't. The outlines themselves are usually black, since they are doing most of the work defining the objects. Every now and then you'll see white outlines mixed in, and when used sparingly, they can look surprisingly great and add a lot of variety. The further an object is in the distance, the less information it needs. These buildings in the background, for example, are really just silhouettes. They still follow the same rules though: simple shapes, rough parallel lines, and pay lots of attention to the negative space around them. But those are man-made objects. For more organic shapes, I would recommend you to use the pencil tool. Even if you're drawing with a mouse, those little imperfections actually help sell the style. For example, I could have done these curtains with the pen tool. Instead, I used the pencil tool because I wanted that awkward hand-drawn look. The hills in the background were done exactly the same way. The pencil tool, along with some help from the simplify command with Ctrl and L. And on top of that, the great thing is that using the pencil tool is actually faster than using the pen tool, so it works great with our whole workflow. Once you've designed a good tree, a couple of bushes, or some rocks or a few clouds, you don't have to keep redrawing them from scratch. You can duplicate them, resize them, recolor them, or flip them, or make small changes to create dozens of variations in just a few seconds. In fact, I'd highly recommend starting your own little asset library. Every project you finish should leave you with a few more reusable elements for the next one. Over time, you'll be surprised how quickly it grows. To help you get started, I also made a free vector asset pack that you can download from the description. It includes trees, rocks, grass, clouds, hills, and a bunch of other simple assets that you can drag into your own compositions. I originally designed them with the 90s and early 2000s cartoon style in mind, but because so many later productions were heavily inspired by UPA, they fit this style almost perfectly. In fact, I used some of these trees and clouds in this very background. Of course, at some point you'll probably want to go beyond using pre-made assets and start creating your own. That's where my 13 Inkscape courses bundle comes in. Here you learn everything you need to make your own illustrations, not just in the UPA style. The bundle contains beginner-aimed courses on character design, background design, game art, and more, and now it comes with a 30-day plan to help you finish all 70 hours of content in just 30 days. Link in the description. And the nice thing about starting with a style like this is that it's incredibly forgiving. If you wanted to make a completely faithful UPA background, you'd actually need even fewer assets than the ones I used here. My nature scene leans a little more towards the Hanna-Barbera style, so it's a little busier, but the same principles still apply. Before making this video, I always thought the best balance between beautiful artwork and a fast workflow came from the cartoons of the 90s and early 2000s, but after spending a few days studying the UPA style, I realized people had already figured this out more than 70 years ago. What I like most about this style is that, yes, it looks good as it is, but nothing stops you from building on top of it to make more detailed stuff as your skills improve. I think that's what makes it such a great starting point for anyone who wants to get into vector illustration, animation, or even making their own games with Inkscape. So, if you've been thinking about making your own animation, consider starting with the UPA style. I feel it's heavily underused in the animation spaces, and it still looks great. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm thinking about turning this into a series where I study different art styles and show you how to recreate them in Inkscape. So, let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.